Chapter 25, America Moves to the City, 1865 to 1900. I thought about trying to sing some Sinatra for you, but that's just not going to happen. I do want to say, however, that contextualization, as I said in class today, is something we should focus on. As you go through this chapter, try to see how it relates to the Gilded Age politics we talked about. See how it relates to industrialization, and I think that's going to help you in May. All right, how about a few key points tonight? Cities, they grow very rapidly, both in size and population, and as a result of that, there's a number of problems that emerge that the federal government and state governments don't really do anything about. In fact, it's municipal governments that do address these issues to some extent, and that's, of course, going to be led by these political machines. We'll talk more about that within this chapter and in the future. In addition to that, there are several challenges to the norm, both in terms of morality, both in terms of the population makeup, what people are doing, where they're working, and so forth. As you can see, morals, customs, and beliefs, and that is somewhat rejected by mainstream America. All right, so globally, cities are growing, and New York City in 1900 was also quite large, as you can see, 3.5 million people there. It's the second largest city in the world behind London. We're going to start to see skyscrapers appearing first in Chicago. It's only a 10-story building. I'll show you a picture of that in a second here. Mass transit will help folks move around that city. It's the electric trolley. That also allows for urban sprawl. People who can afford to later on will move out of the city because you'll see they're, by modern standards, somewhat unlivable. After 1900, electricity, indoor plumbing, and telephones are much more common, and that does make cities a more livable place. But as I just said, there's a lot of problems, which we'll discuss in a few slides here. You can see sort of the American population and the shift from rural to urban, 1900, 1910, 1920. You can see that trend balancing out and then sort of favoring the urban side. If you look at the major cities here, New York City in 1860, 1.1 million or so. By 1880, almost 2 million. By 1900, 3.5 million. So that's some pretty rapid growth. And you can imagine there's a lot of problems that are associated with that. And here's that building that I just mentioned before, Chicago's home insurance building. I think it was torn down in 1913, your first skyscraper. A far cry from this, and I'm not even kidding you, this gives me vertigo just looking at it. Okay, so cities now and then obviously are the center for cultural change and cultural diversity, and that's wonderful. The text does mention Macy's and Marshall Fields. That's sort of like a hub for fashion for upper middle class women to go and shop and so forth. And in addition to that, though, there's also problems associated with putting a lot of people in a small amount of space. Crime and poverty, overcrowded homes and overcrowded streets for that matter, sanitation, what do you do with wastewater and so forth, and then trash removal. All of those happen very quickly, and they develop in a way that overwhelms the infrastructure of these early cities. You see here this sort of common pump that people are all trying to access. You can see here children, of course, who we don't know exactly if they're orphans or what the case may be, but obviously it's cold there and they're not prepared for that and they're alone. And here you have kids who are, I guess, to some extent just being kids, but obviously there's a horse in the background and they don't even seem to be bothered by that. It just seems to be normal life for them. All right, so folks who did have a home inside the cities tended to live in these tenement buildings, and they are basically overcrowded apartment buildings, as you can see here. Landlords just stuffed as many rooms in as they possibly could. In 2018, the renters have far more rights than the landlords have, and for good reason, because very often, at least in the past, landlords would exploit the folks who rented from them. There was very little regulation whatsoever. In fact, the first bit of regulation that I know of is that each room had to have access to fresh air, and so the solution to that was to install these inner shafts that you can see. And ultimately, they did more harm than good, as people put trash down there. They sort of were breeding grounds for disease and so forth. The inside of your apartment, while it certainly was people's homes, and I'm sure that they loved them and cherished them, they were extremely small. And you can see this large family here crammed into, and we can only see one bit of this space, but chances are there is not much more behind the camera. So what they did was they often utilized their fire escapes as living space or as a space to put their clutter, and so there's just more safety hazards associated with that. In class, we're going to look at Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, in which he vividly describes tenement life. So in chapter 25, they first start talking about new immigrants. And before we do that, we should remind ourselves about the old immigrants. And these are the folks who came before 1880. That's kind of the turning point year that we use. They tended to be from Northern and Western Europe. They were more likely to be Anglo-Saxon. They spoke English. They were more likely to be literate. And they adjusted to American life relatively easily. Now, the new immigrants who come following or after 1880, they're from Southern and Eastern Europe. And as such, they don't speak English. They also were less likely to be Protestant. In fact, they are very often Catholic. They're Eastern Orthodox. They're Jewish. And they were very likely to be illiterate, poor, and without many job skills. And so we're going to see a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment that's applied specifically to the new immigrants. So why did they leave Southern Europe and Eastern Europe? Well, there's a couple of reasons, and we have push factors and pull factors, and I'm sure you've heard those phrases before, but let's remind ourselves. So what would pull you to America? Well, hearing about the wonders of America, whether it's from family members who have already traveled there and are writing back to you, or perhaps by advertisements from railroad companies and steamship companies and so forth that are talking about the wonders of America and the availability of jobs. That certainly might bring you across the pond to the United States. In addition to that, there are a number of push factors, and the text references the persecution of minorities in Europe. Specifically, they said there was tens of thousands of Russian Jews that were becoming refugees or forced out of their own home in the 1880s, and many of them did come to the United States as well. Now, as we were saying before, that in cities, because there's so much growth so quickly, something has to be done. And unfortunately, the federal government and state governments don't really address the issues in cities. And so that's going to leave it to the municipal governments, city governments. And we've already talked about these political machines in chapter 23, so just remind yourself of what they were. These are political organizations that did do some positive things, but ultimately they were out for the business of keeping themselves in power. And they do sort of become an early form of welfare. They do give handouts, they do provide jobs, they do provide housing, they do help relocate people, they do give gifts to people who are in need, and in return, it's expected that those people will vote for them. And so you can see Boss Tweed in the bottom of your screen. I'll let you decide which is his actual picture and which is a cartoon representation of him. But to some extent, the municipal governments that emerge are going to do a positive good for immigrants. Obviously, they are doing this through their graft and greed and corruption. Take a look at this graph real quick. You can see that we have a real peak in immigration in 1901. We're going to see some serious decline in that, obviously, in the years that follow. There are quota laws put in place in the early 1920s, and that severely restricts immigration in this country. And you can see here, 1900, the place of origin of where these folks were coming from. And so while the largest group of immigrants is still from Northern and Western Europe, the next largest group, as you can see, will be from Southern and Eastern Europe. By the way, we should point out that in New York City and other cities, immigrants did settle into these small little ethnic neighborhoods. And as we talked about in class today, Little Italy, Little China, Chinatown, excuse me, these are places that we may have been to. We know what that actually is like. Well, that is something that continues obviously to today. As you can see, a more modern view of New York City, modern map, excuse me, and the various ethnic groups and where they settled. And they did this so they had familiarity around them. So they had sort of a place that resembled the old country. They had a support system that they could identify with. Okay, so the same nativism that we saw with the Irish and the Germans in the 1840s and 50s will be back in the 1880s and 90s, just directed towards the new immigrants, as I said in the previous slide. And like in the past with the Know Nothing Party, which was really a nativist political party, the American Protective Association in 1887 is formed, and they begin to urge people to vote against Roman Catholics. In 1882, Congress attempts to restrict immigration as well. They pass a law denying the entry of paupers, criminals, and convicts. And 3 years later, they ban the importation of foreign workers that were under contract. So I believe that would mean that these workers would have signed a contract for work and potentially lower wages than the American workers were getting at that time before they left their home port. Don't forget also Congress had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and again the Chinese are not considered part of the new immigrants, but still there's a trend towards restricting immigration by the end of the 19th century. And we're actually going to hit this cartoon in class tomorrow. So if you want to pause this now, you can do that as historical context, intended audience, purpose, and point of view. Now, there is a liberal Protestant sect that emerges between 1875 and 1925, and they are going to take a more progressive look at the Bible. They are opposed to the material wealth that is being accumulated by some, and they start to enter into mainstream Protestantism throughout the end of the 19th century. They look at the Bible and its teachings as a model for Christian behavior rather than a literal account of events. In addition to that, you should understand that Roman Catholics will soon become the largest denomination with roughly 9 million communicants by 1900. And Jewish Americans are growing significantly as a group as well. Now, in 1859, Darwin's On the Origin of the Species is published, and of course, it talks about natural selection and evolution, and that is going to directly challenge traditional Christian belief in creationism and the dogma of special creations, which saw each species as being specifically created by God. Many natural scientists, in fact, most of them, reject this idea of natural selection until about 1875, and then it sort of becomes a bit more mainstream. The religious community, however, is going to be split. There are those who we now call fundamentalists who insist upon this literal interpretation of the Bible, and we reject anything other than that. And then there are the modernists, as we sometimes call them, or the accommodationists, that will be, as I said before, a bit more progressive. They're a bit more liberal in their interpretation. And again, they start to see the Bible as more of a guideline as opposed to a literal account of events. Again, with the hip, take a look at this cartoon. Think about who would agree with this cartoon, who would oppose this cartoon. What's the point of this cartoon? Big changes in the world of education occur at the end of the 19th century. By 1870, most states are making a grade school education compulsory, as in it's mandatory. By the 1880s and 1890s, secondary schools were much more commonplace. Both of those will be tax supported. In fact, students will receive free textbooks, high school students, on the taxpayer's dollar, and so that's pretty progressive. Teacher training schools, which were then called normal schools, were growing in number, and kindergarten was being adopted, the best year of school, let's be serious. In addition to that, we still have schools in the private sector. Typically, they're religious schools, parochial schools, and they are a big part of the American education system as well. Let's talk about two very influential people who pick up the cause for civil rights at a time when the federal government is not really doing much of anything for that. Keep in mind that after 1877, Reconstruction ends, so to say, and ultimately they turn their attention in other directions and sort of leave the cause for the freedmen someplace else. These two men have very different ideas as to what African Americans should do and what American society should do. So let's talk about that now. First of all, is Booker T. Washington. He's an ex-slave. He's from the South, and he believed that blacks should be educated in the trades so they could gain self-respect and economic security. Sort of economic independence would be the precursor to civil rights. He was labeled an accommodationist, as someone who seeks compromise. In fact, he's called an Uncle Tom by W.E.B. Du Bois. It's a very negative thing to call someone, as you can imagine here. But he is going to be the head of the Tuskegee Institute, and he takes that post in 1881. He also brings George Washington Carver onto the faculty in 1896, who helped to revitalize the Southern economy by finding hundreds of uses for peanuts, sweet potatoes, and soybeans. W.E.B. Du Bois did earn his Ph.D. from Harvard. He's the first African American to do so, and he demanded immediate political equality for blacks. He did help found the NAACP in 1909, and he argued that the talented tenth of the black community should be given full access to mainstream American life. There's Booker T right here. The differences between these two reflect the contrasting life experiences of Southern and Northern blacks. That's a statement I've seen in the pageant. And here's W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, you might recall we did talk about this a few chapters ago, the Morrill Act of 1862 and the extension of that, the Hatch Act of 1887. Both of these will basically be federal aid for education, federal funding. And the Morrill Act, as you can see, granted public land to the states to support public education. Much of that land will become state universities. The Hatch Act of 1887 is specifically going to help fund agricultural institutions, and I think the text mentions the University of California and Texas A&M as examples of that. Now, there's also private philanthropy that does contribute to the funding of universities, and many of them bear the names of these industrialists, including Vanderbilt University, for example. Duke University, we mentioned that in chapter 24, so keep that in mind as well. There's also new colleges that are specific to groups of people that would not otherwise be able to attend college. So Howard University, for example, is an African American college, and Vassar becomes a women's college, as you can see. Johns Hopkins is the first significant graduate school in the United States of America, and future President Woodrow Wilson received his Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins, and it was founded in 1876. So the pageant tells us that the classical American curriculum sort of saw this bond between knowledge and morality, but in the post-Darwin world, university educators began to separate facts from values. And so practical courses, which specialize in vocational training and the sciences, emerge. And as you can imagine, they are very appealing. There's also this concept of the elective system. Just like your high school curriculum allows you to choose certain courses that are interesting to you, students in the late 19th century began to have the opportunity to do the same thing. There's also medical schools emerging in the post-Civil War. In addition to that, behavioral psychology as a discipline can trace its roots to William James in his The Principles of Psychology, written in 1890, and he also contributed to philosophy with his concept of pragmatism, which said that the truth of an idea was to be tested above all in practical experiences. So the printed word has a profound impact on American society, on all societies for that matter, and Americans had more access to the written word than ever before. Public libraries were growing, especially in Boston and New York City. That is, the Library of Congress opened its doors in 1897, and private institutions were being funded by many of these wealthy industrialists. Andrew Carnegie, as I said in chapter 24, does embark upon this sort of crusade of philanthropy, and he donated $60 million for the construction of nearly 1,700 public libraries in America alone. He also funded the creation of, I think, another 700 libraries in the English-speaking world outside of the United States. Two journalists that we should know, we'll talk about more in the next chapter or so, is Joseph Pulitzer on the left, William Randolph Hearst on the right. We now call them yellow journalists. This is a phrase that came from, Joseph Pulitzer had a comic strip that was called The Yellow Kid, and that's where the phrase originated from. But what they did was try to outsell one another by printing these sensational stories, and as a result of that, they have a pretty large impact on American public opinion, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Spanish-American War. A couple of other books and authors you should know: Edward Bellamy, Looking Backward. A man in his story had fallen asleep, and when he woke up in the year 2000, I believe, the government had nationalized big business to serve the interests of the public. Certainly a shout out to some socialist ideas. Horatio Alger, we talked about him in chapter 24. All of his books have basically the same plot line. Basically, it's a sort of humble beginnings for a person, and this person is virtuous and honest, and they're hardworking, and they often have a little help from someone who recognizes how great they are, and as a result, they experience this rag to riches path. Again, this inspired many people to side with the interest of business and continue working in conditions that you and I would probably consider to be deplorable. Frank Norris and the Octopus about the railroads and corrupt politicians. Jacob A. Reese, How the Other Half Lives. Again, as I said earlier, we're going to read a portion of this in class. But like Uncle Tom's Cabin before it, this is an example of how people are now going to be exposed to the truth of tenement living. People who didn't really have any connection to it will see just how the other half lives, and it is appalling. All right, so this section really talks about challenges to the rigid moral code that dominated American society, at least the moral code that dominated polite conversation, sort of the expectation of how Americans believed other people were behaving. In 1871, a woman here named Victoria Woodhull publicly proclaimed to believe in free love. You can imagine how scandalous that would have been. Divorce becomes much more common towards the end of the 19th century, not to the levels that it is today, but I'll show you a chart in a second that depicts that. And the birth rate declined for practical reasons. Living in a tenement, you don't have much space, and in fact, you had more mouths to feed, and it's not as though you were on the farm or the frontier where your kids could work alongside you in the field. So, given the new living patterns, you see changes in family structure that result from that. And you can see how, beginning in 1890, the divorce rate it significantly increases. All right, so towards the end of the 19th century, we see a resurgence in the fight for women's suffrage. And in fact, in 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association is founded by Carrie Chapman Catt. And while it's not until 1920 that we have suffrage on the national level for women, we do see individual states and territories allowing that. For example, Wyoming in 1869 is the first territory to grant unrestricted suffrage to women. We will talk in the future about why Western states and territories often gave more rights to women than their Eastern counterparts. So, sort of keeping in line with this battle for morality, there is a real push for prohibition and temperance. And alcohol is increasingly being seen as the root cause of all evil. It's associated with poverty, with domestic abuse and neglect. And so, therefore, there's a lot of sense that can be made from that. But it's not until the 20th century, in the 18th Amendment, that prohibition is enacted. But still, we have in 1874 the Women's Christian Temperance Union being very vocal. As you can see here, they're led by Frances E. Williard, who is described as a saint in the textbook, and Carrie A. Nation, who would work herself up into a frenzy, enter into these saloons and bars, and bust up the kegs of beer and bottles of liquor with a hatchet. Again, I think the book does reference her as being a little bit deranged, perhaps, but I think she's sending quite a statement with that behavior. Also in 1893, the Anti-Saloon League is formed, and way back when, in 1869, I forgot to mention, the Prohibition Party was organized as well. Some literary approaches here. There's realism, naturalism, and regionalism. Realism was an attempt to show society how it actually was. And as I understand it, naturalism was sort of a continuation of that, but also looking at hereditary and social influences. I think like going back to a primal state. I could be wrong on that. Regionalism is an extension of those two, and it adds sort of the local influence, the regional influence. What does being a New York City resident, how does that impact your life as opposed to being a frontiersman or a farmer on the frontier? In terms of artistic triumphs, one thing I'd like to mention is the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893. It was celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage, and 27 million people, which is roughly 40% of the nation's population, did attend this. So at the end of the 19th century, Americans had a lot of options for amusement. Here's a vaudeville poster. Vaudeville shows were variety shows. You could go to one and see a number of different acts within the same show, so it's appealing to a wide audience. Similar to that were these minstrel shows. And within the minstrel shows, though, you often had white Americans who were wearing blackface and portraying African Americans as aloof and clueless. And as the century comes to a close, African Americans begin to perform in these as well. Baseball emerges. The National League is born in 1876, and baseball was a way for cities to compete with one another. You get pride in your ball club, and so there's like this urban competition that exists. Football here in the college level, you see there's a mean bunch of guys you can see here, does begin. This, by the way, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but this is a photo from the Carlisle Indian School, which is a boarding school that Native American students were brought to help them assimilate into American culture. And they had football teams and bands and so forth, and they competed with white schools. And so this football team was quite successful. I do think they beat Harvard. You can see on the ball there. And in the center row, the man with the large C on his chest is Jim Thorpe, who many people think of him as the best athlete in American history. And we'll talk about that more down the road. Boxing here, as you can see here, whether bare knuckle or otherwise. This is John L. Sullivan. He was an Irish boxer, excuse me. This was a sport that people identified with sort of like the ethnic group of the boxer he was fighting. So as opposed to baseball with urban groups, this was slightly different. But again, people rallied around their favorite pugilist. Basketball was being created in the Northeast here in Springfield College, I believe, Dr. Naismith, and the safety bicycle, where both wheels are about the same size, a lot easier to ride down the road, get on and dismount your bike. In addition to that, there was the circus, and that is something that has since gone away to some extent, at least the traditional circus as you would see here. And that's it for tonight, so thanks so much for watching. Look forward to class tomorrow. Take care.